Robert F. Kennedy's widow, Ethel Kennedy, has died at the age of 96. Her grandson, Joe Kennedy III, announced the news on social media.
First, she lost her parents in a plane crash. Then her husband was murdered right in front of her. But that was just the beginning of Ethel Kennedy's nightmare. Two of her sons died horrible deaths. Her grandson drowned. Her granddaughter overdosed. Now, at 96, her own son betrayed everything she stood for. The Kennedy curse wasn't just real. It followed this poor woman to her grave, and the most shocking part? Her final heartbreak came just days before she died. Ethel Skakel was born into a world of luxury. Her father, George Skakel, started out poor, earning just $8 a week working for the railroad. But he had a sharp eye. He noticed that coal companies were throwing away something called coke, a coal byproduct. In 1919, he and two partners started a company with just $1,000. They bought that waste coal and cleaned it up so it could be used in making aluminum. It turned out to be a gold mine. By the time Ethel was a baby, her father was already a multimillionaire. When she was 8, the family moved into a massive 31-room mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. It looked like an English country estate, and it had once belonged to the widow of the Simmons mattress fortune. The house was beautiful, but the Skakels weren't like most rich families in town. They were loud, wild, and Catholic, which made them stand out in the mostly quiet Protestant neighborhood. Still, young Ethel made friends easily. People liked her charm and energy. Life at the Skakel house was far from calm. There were 7 kids, dogs running around, and constant noise. Ethel grew up in a place where things were always happening, and no one worried too much about rules. That same chaos would later show up in her own home once she started her own family. Ethel went to good schools. She started at Greenwich Academy, then went to a Catholic school in the Bronx, and later to Manhattanville College. She was never the top student, but she was active, athletic, and social. She loved horseback riding and often competed in equestrian events. Her mother was a large, strong-willed woman who cared deeply about her church and her place in society. From her, Ethel learned how important faith could be. Catholicism became a core part of her life, something she would hold on to even during her hardest moments. One of those moments would come much later, but her future began to take shape during a ski trip in 1945. Ethel was 17 and went to Mount Tremblant in Canada with friends. That's where she met Robert F. Kennedy for the first time. The funny thing was, Bobby was actually dating Ethel's sister at the time. The meeting happened because Ethel's college roommate was Jean Kennedy, Bobby's sister. That winter trip also brought Ethel face-to-face with John F. Kennedy. She didn't know it yet, but both brothers would play huge roles in her future. Eventually, Bobby and her sister broke up, and a few years later, Ethel and Bobby began dating. In 1950, they got married in a grand ceremony at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenwich. It was a big event, with both families fully involved. John F. Kennedy was Bobby's best man, and Ethel's sister Patricia was the matron of honor. The party afterward was loud, wild, and unforgettable. At one point, all the bridesmaids were thrown into the pool. After their honeymoon in Hawaii, the couple settled down in Virginia. Bobby was in law school, and Ethel began a life that would be filled with politics, children, and both joy and heartbreak. Even before she officially joined the Kennedy family, Ethel had shown an interest in their world. For her college thesis, she chose to write about John F. Kennedy's book, Why England Slept. The book was about Britain's failure to prepare for war. JFK had written it while still in college, and it had already sold well. By choosing that topic, Ethel showed that she wasn't just marrying into the family, she was also trying to understand what made them tick. Once married, she jumped right into the political scene. In 1952, while pregnant with her second child, she campaigned hard for her brother-in-law John during his Senate run. She organized tea parties to meet voters and even worked up until the night before giving birth. In 1964, when Robert was criticized for running for Senate in New York, even though he wasn't from there, Ethel came up with a clever line to calm people down. "There is only so much you can do for Massachusetts." In 1962, she and Bobby were sent on a goodwill tour to 14 countries. Though it wasn't an official diplomatic mission, many saw them as representing the President and First Lady. Ethel was becoming more than a wife. She was a skilled political partner. But life wasn't always easy. In 1955, tragedy struck when Ethel's parents were killed in a plane crash. She was pregnant with her fourth child when it happened. Despite the pain, she kept going. She took care of her growing family and stood by her husband. That loss was the first of many, and it marked the start of a life filled with both privilege and heartbreak. A year later, Ethel and Bobby bought a new home, Hickory Hill, a large estate in McLean, Virginia. They bought it from John and Jacqueline Kennedy for $125,000. The house had once belonged to a Supreme Court justice. It was huge, with 18 rooms, 7 fireplaces, and even a reptile house in the basement, which Ethel had built as a surprise for one of her sons. Hickory Hill became the center of their busy lives and stayed in the family for more than 50 years. Ethel Kennedy lived through some of the most intense years in American politics. She wasn't just a bystander. She was right in the middle of it all, often behind the scenes, always backing her husband, Robert F. Kennedy. Back in the 1950s, Robert worked with Senator Joe McCarthy during the infamous hearings. But things got tense fast. Robert and another lawyer, Roy Cohn, couldn't stand each other. They clashed hard. At one point, Robert told McCarthy he had to choose between them. McCarthy chose Cohn, so Robert quit. But 6 months later, he came back. This time not just to fight McCarthy, but to go after Cohn. He was serious about it. One day, he found McCarthy's secretary in a Senate beauty salon and said, "I'm going to protect McCarthy in every way I can. But I am really out to get that little son of a bitch Cohn." Ethel stood by him through all of it, calm on the outside, even while everything around them was heating up. When JFK ran for president in 1960, Ethel jumped right in. She campaigned with passion, never holding back. She wasn't new to politics. She had been helping since she first started dating Robert, way back in 1946, during JFK's run for Congress. By 1960, Ethel had 7 kids at home, but that didn't stop her. She balanced everything: rallies, speeches, travel, and still managed to raise her family. Her bright, bubbly style made her a natural with voters. Where JFK was smooth and careful, Ethel was full of life and honesty. People noticed. But it wasn't all campaign trails and handshakes. The early 60s were filled with crisis. Ethel stayed close as the Kennedys faced huge moments: the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Civil Rights Movement, and more. In 1962, President Kennedy sent Robert and Ethel on a 28-day trip to 14 countries. It was meant to be informal, but everyone treated them like the President and First Lady. Ethel stepped up, smiling through it all, helping the world see a softer side of American power. Then, in November 1963, she picked up the phone at home. It was the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover. He had never called their house before. She handed the phone to Robert. That's when they found out JFK had been shot. Everything changed in that moment. Ethel had to stay strong, even as the world around them fell apart. At home, Ethel had her own way of raising their kids. She didn't keep them away from politics or big events. She brought them right into it. From the start, she wanted her children to understand the world and help change it. Their home, Hickory Hill, wasn't just a house. It was a buzzing, wild place where politicians, activists, and thinkers came together. Ethel made sure her kids saw history happening up close. Their parties were loud and legendary. The Kennedys didn't hide from the spotlight. They lived in it. And Ethel made sure her kids did too. But not every relationship in her life was smooth. Her connection with Jackie Kennedy was complicated. They were very different people. Ethel loved the outdoors and roughhousing. Jackie was elegant, private, and careful. Their first meeting hinted at trouble ahead. Jackie showed up to Ethel's St. Patrick's Day party in a black dress. Ethel had strangely asked for it. Everyone else wore green. Jackie arrived in a Rolls-Royce. Right away, they seemed worlds apart. Ethel liked playing football with the men. Jackie once broke her ankle during a game and never played again. Ethel teased her for it. Things got even more tense after JFK died. Robert spent a lot of time with Jackie. Some people whispered. One of Ethel's own sisters-in-law even asked, "What are you going to do about it? Bobby's spending an awful lot of time with the widder." Still, despite the cold moments, they never fully broke. Decades later, Ethel was there when Jackie passed away. Ethel Kennedy was at home with her husband, Robert, on November 22, 1963, when everything changed. The phone rang. It was J. Edgar Hoover, delivering the worst possible news. President John F. Kennedy had been shot. Hoover didn't stay on the line long enough for questions. He just hung up. It was a cruel, cold moment, one that would stay with Robert forever. Ethel watched as her husband jumped into action. He called the White House, ordered the locks on JFK's files to be changed, and had the taping system in the Oval Office dismantled. Meanwhile, across the country, chaos spread. Cars stopped in the streets. Crowds gathered. Schools closed early. The nation was in shock. But for Ethel, it was more than national tragedy. It was deeply personal. It was the beginning of a life marked by grief, public mourning, and a quiet strength that few ever saw coming. In the days that followed, Ethel became the steady force behind Robert. While the world watched him grieve, she carried the weight of their family's sorrow in silence. She stayed strong for their children. She helped hold Robert together. He had to be there for Jackie, for Caroline and John Jr., and Ethel never once let her own pain get in the way. Their faith became a lifeline. Every day, Ethel leaned into her Catholic beliefs, trying to find peace in prayer. Behind closed doors, she was the one who made sure the family kept going, who helped Robert find the strength to keep moving forward. He didn't just lose a brother, he lost a part of himself. But Ethel wouldn't let him drift. Her love, her calm, her resilience, they gave him the courage to keep fighting. That courage turned into something bigger. The grief didn't fade, but it transformed Robert. He changed. He became more focused, more driven, more willing to challenge the system. Ethel stood by him through all of it. When he decided to run for Senate in New York, she was right there beside him. Some people mocked him, called him a carpetbagger because he wasn't from the state. It didn't matter. Ethel hit the campaign trail hard, even with their huge family to care for. She made people laugh, even when they were hostile. When critics questioned the move, she joked, "There's only so much you can do for Massachusetts." The crowds didn't always welcome them, but Ethel kept going. She pushed through the hecklers, the signs, the doubts. And in the end, Robert won. He found his new political home in New York, and Ethel had helped him get there. That move wasn't just about politics. It was about starting over. Massachusetts wasn't an option. Ted was already there. So they planted new roots. It was risky. The press wasn't kind. But Ethel helped reframe the story. She made it work. She gave the campaign heart. And when Robert joined Ted in the Senate, it made history. Two brothers side by side in the halls of power. It was a triumph, but it didn't erase the pain that had come before. If anything, it reminded Ethel how fragile everything really was. JFK's assassination did more than change the nation. It opened a door to a darker reality. Ethel felt it. The violence, the grief, the endless headlines. It became a pattern. A few years later, it happened again. Robert was shot in Los Angeles just after winning the California primary. Ethel was there just steps away when it happened. By the time she turned 40, she had already lost her parents in a plane crash, her brother in another, and two of the most important men in her life to gunfire. And it didn't stop there. She would go on to lose her son David to drugs, and her son Michael in a skiing accident. The grief kept coming, one tragedy after another. Ethel Kennedy wasn't just the wife standing behind Robert F. Kennedy during his 1968 presidential campaign. She was right in the middle of it. Even though she was pregnant with their 11th child, she showed up at rally after rally, riding through cities, waving to crowds, and cheering alongside people packed shoulder to shoulder in the streets. One day in March, she stood with RFK as he met Cesar Chavez, who had just finished a long hunger strike for farm workers' rights. That moment helped connect RFK's campaign with Latino communities, and Ethel was right there, smiling and strong. She had always been political, even before the campaign. Back when RFK was working in the Senate, she went to almost every hearing and got to know reporters and their families. If she thought someone was being treated unfairly, she spoke up. That was just who she was, sharp, tough, and ready to act. Not everyone in the family wanted RFK to run. His brother Ted was against it at first, but Ethel believed it was the right time. And as the campaign rolled on, Ted came around too. Then came June 5th, 1968. RFK had just won the California primary, and the crowd at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles was chanting his name. Ethel was nearby when he walked off the stage and into the kitchen pantry. That's when the shots rang out. RFK was leaning over to shake a young busboy's hand when Sirhan came forward with a gun. He fired 8 times. One bullet grazed RFK's forehead. Another hit his neck. The fatal shot struck behind his ear. Some witnesses later said there may have been a second shooter. But no matter how many theories followed, nothing changed the heartbreak that followed. Ethel stayed by his side as they rushed him to the hospital. She didn't break down, even though she had just seen her husband shot right in front of her. The next day, he was gone. And still, Ethel didn't cry. The Kennedys had a saying, "Kennedys don't cry," and she lived by it. Even Coretta Scott King, whose own husband had been assassinated only 2 months earlier, was stunned by Ethel's strength. She said she didn't know how Ethel managed to carry herself with such grace. But Ethel's strength didn't stop there. When Ted Kennedy later drove off a bridge in a car accident that killed a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechny, Ethel reached out to Mary Jo's family. She told them their daughter was now happy on the golden streets of heaven. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to them. Just hours after RFK died, Ethel boarded the plane that would carry his body back to New York. You'd expect someone in her position to sit quietly, lost in her grief. But Ethel did something different. She walked up and down the aisles, making sure every passenger had a pillow or a blanket. She took care of others, even when her own heart was broken. That quiet kindness became one of the moments people remembered most. Coretta Scott King flew to Los Angeles to be with her. The two women, both young widows, stood together as the world mourned. When RFK's body traveled by train from New York to Washington, people lined the tracks for hours. Some held signs, others just stood in silence. Photos from that day showed the entire country, black and white, rich and poor, coming together to say goodbye. And right in the middle of it were Ethel and Coretta, holding on to each other, showing the world what strength and unity looked like. 6 months later, Ethel was still pregnant, but didn't stop moving forward. From her bedroom, under doctor's orders to rest, she announced the creation of the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Foundation. She wanted to help young people, fight poverty, and push for peace. Everything RFK believed in. It was the start of something huge. That foundation would go on to fight for human rights around the world. Ethel didn't just sit in offices, she showed up. In 1969, she flew to support Native American activists on Alcatraz Island. She marched with farm workers and faced down dictators in Africa. She even waded into a polluted river in Washington, D.C., pulling out tires with former gang members by her side. She wasn't afraid to get dirty because she believed change came from action. When she visited places like Haiti, South Africa, or the mountains of Mexico, it wasn't just for show. She listened, she spoke out, she even filled a huge airplane with supplies and flew it to help people in need. In 2001, she went to a Mexican jail to visit environmental activists and gave one of them a major award, shining a light on their struggle. Her work never stopped. She protested outside embassies. She marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. She raised money and hope. And when President Obama awarded her the Medal of Freedom in 2014, it was more than a tribute. It was a thank you from the country she never stopped fighting for. Even at 87, she was still showing up, still making a difference. At a fundraiser for Barack Obama, she sat at the same estate where her children had once played, still carrying the same spark that had lit up RFK's campaign all those years ago. Ethel Kennedy turned grief into purpose, heartbreak into action. And through it all, she stayed true to herself, fierce, fearless, and full of love. Ethel Kennedy lived a life surrounded by love, legacy, and unbearable loss. Her world first shattered in April 1984, when her 28-year-old son David died alone in a Palm Beach hotel room. He had been battling addiction for years, and that Easter, his behavior became so erratic that the family asked him to leave. Hours later, he overdosed on a deadly mix of drugs. When he missed his flight to Boston, Ethel called the hotel, hoping for good news. Instead, she hung up the phone after softly saying, "He's dead, isn't he?" Just when the family began to heal, tragedy struck again. On New Year's Eve in 1997, her son Michael died in a skiing accident in Aspen. He had been playing a game of football on skis, despite warnings from ski patrol. While chasing a pass, he slammed into a tree. His children watched in horror as paramedics tried and failed to save him. The loss was sudden, violent, and devastating. It happened 13 years after David's death, and people once again whispered about the Kennedy curse. But Michael's life had already been under a cloud. Just months before he died, the public learned of his affair with his teenage babysitter, a relationship that reportedly began when the girl was only 14. The scandal shocked the nation. It even forced Michael's brother Joseph to pull out of a run for governor. Michael had also struggled with alcohol and had quietly gone to rehab just before his grandmother Rose Kennedy died. The tragedies didn't stop there. In 1999, Ethel's nephew John F. Kennedy Jr., the shining symbol of the next generation, died when his plane crashed into the Atlantic. His wife Carolyn and her sister were with him. The world held its breath for 5 long days as divers searched the ocean floor. When they finally found the wreckage, JFK Jr. was still strapped into the pilot's seat. The loss was felt around the world, but for Ethel, it was heartbreak all over again. Years passed, but pain returned in 2012. Mary Richardson Kennedy, the estranged wife of Ethel's son, Robert Jr., took her own life in a small building behind their home. She had been struggling with depression, substance abuse, and a painful divorce. Her life had spiraled out of control. In the end, alcohol and sorrow overwhelmed her. She was just 52. In 2019, tragedy came again. Ethel's 22-year-old granddaughter, Saoirse Kennedy Hill, died of an accidental overdose at the Kennedy family compound. Bright, driven, and outspoken, Saoirse had written publicly about her battle with depression. She wanted to help others. Instead, she became another heartbreaking chapter in her family's long history of loss. Her death shook the family to its core. Less than a year later, in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, Ethel's granddaughter Maeve and great-grandson Gideon drowned while trying to retrieve a kickball from the Chesapeake Bay. A sudden wind pushed their canoe too far from shore. They were spotted struggling, then vanished. After days of searching, both bodies were found in the water. Maeve first, then her son. Neither had worn a life jacket. Through all of this, Ethel stood strong. She leaned on her deep Catholic faith, attending Mass daily, reading her Bible, and praying the Rosary. She rarely opened up about her grief, but once said, "I pretty well lived in the moment, and I was blessed with faith." That faith gave her the strength to keep going, even after burying her husband, 2 sons, a daughter-in-law, 3 grandchildren, and a great-grandchild. Even those close to her couldn't understand how she stayed composed. After Michael's death, someone said she looked literally paralyzed with grief. Yet she didn't cry, didn't scream. She just stood by his body. After Saoirse died, Ethel quietly said, "The world is a little less beautiful today." It was a rare glimpse into her pain. Ethel Kennedy passed away in 2024 at the age of 96. She had survived more heartbreak than most people can imagine, but she never gave up. She stayed devoted to her family, her faith, and her causes. And through it all, she remained a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of incredible strength. Ethel Kennedy was 93 when she made a rare public statement in 2021. She didn't often speak to the press, but this time she felt she had to. Sirhan Sirhan, the man who had shot her husband, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, more than 5 decades earlier, was recommended for parole. Ethel didn't hesitate. She sent a note to NBC News saying he should not be paroled. That was it. Just one line, handwritten. But it said everything. Her words stood in direct contrast to what 2 of her sons, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Douglas Kennedy, believed. They supported Sirhan's release, and for the first time in 16 parole hearings, members of the Kennedy family were no longer united. 6 of Ethel's other children quickly came to her side. They didn't want Sirhan freed either. Suddenly, the world saw something it had rarely seen before: public disagreement inside one of America's most iconic families. That rift only deepened in 2024. In August, things took an even stranger turn. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. dropped his independent presidential bid and did something almost no one expected. he endorsed Donald Trump. For the rest of the Kennedy family, it was like being hit by a truck. 5 of his siblings released a blistering statement. They said Bobby's decision betrayed everything their father stood for. Ethel had once gone on a hunger strike to protest Trump's immigration policies. Now, her own son had thrown his support behind the man she had fasted against. Jack Schlossberg, JFK's grandson, didn't hold back. He said on social media that RFK Jr. had sold out. It was clear now, this wasn't just a political difference, this was personal. And the Kennedy name, once firmly rooted in liberal politics, was being pulled in directions no one had imagined. Just 2 months later, heartbreak followed. On October 3rd, Ethel Kennedy had a stroke in her sleep. She was 96 years old. But this wasn't just about age. Just before her stroke, news broke of a scandal involving RFK Jr. and a journalist. Texts had leaked. It was messy. His marriage to actress Cheryl Hines was under strain, and now the press was circling. Family insiders whispered that the stress of it all had finally caught up to Ethel. One source even said, "It killed Ethel to see the Kennedy legacy shredded to tatters by Bobby." Her grandson, Joe Kennedy III, tried to reassure the public. He said she was comfortable, getting the best care, and surrounded by her family. But a well-known doctor later commented that emotional stress can trigger serious health problems, especially at her age. A week later, on October 10th, she passed away. President Biden called her a hero. Others remembered her as the glue that had held the Kennedys together through decades of triumph and tragedy.